Our next speaker is Michael Bogenschutz from the NYU psilocybin program. He's going to talk about psychedelic-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder, a clinical perspective. Can we turn this one on instead? Thank you. Dr. Bogenschutz is research professor of psychiatry at NYU Langone Medical Center. Prior to joining the faculty of NYU in June 2015, he served as professor of psychiatry and psychology, vice chair and division director for addiction psychiatry, and vice chair for clinical research in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. For 10 years, he was principal investigator of the Southwest node of the National Institute on Drug Abuse Clinical Trials Network. These are important roles. He founded and was formerly director of the Addiction Psychiatry Fellowship Program at the University of New Mexico and has extensive experience in mentoring junior investigators. Dr. Bogenschutz's research interests focus on development of novel combinations of pharmacologic and psychosocial therapies to improve outcomes in patients with alcohol and other drug addictions, the integration of addictions treatment into medical settings, and the treatment of co-occurring psychiatric and addictive disorders. He's particularly focused on the development of psychedelic medicines for the treatment of addictions and other psychiatric and behavioral conditions. He's currently conducting a phase 2 randomized double-blind controlled trial of psilocybin-assisted treatment of alcohol use disorder. Dr. Michael Bogenschutz.
Okay. All right, thanks, Neil. Thanks for sticking it out here late into the afternoon, and I just wanted to also, again, thank MAPS and Beckley and everyone who's involved in organizing this amazing conference. And I recall 4 years ago, I was here on the same stage, actually, presenting the very first data that we had from the alcohol pilot study that I will touch on today. And it's amazing how far this work has come, but more generally, how far the whole field has come is just quite amazing. So this talk is going to be a little bit different from ones that I've done before or the ones that have come before. Well, it may have something in common with Mary Cosimano's talk because I'm going to focus really on the participant experiences and the therapeutic process. So I'm going to take the first portion of the talk, which would be introduction and experimental design and rationale, and collapse all that into under 10 minutes, and then spend the majority of the time talking about the experiences and process of working with 3 of the participants in our ongoing double-blind trial of psilocybin-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder. This is my various sources of funding. And just to, it's great to follow Matt because he's given a great introduction of this general field of addiction and psychedelic-assisted treatment of addiction. But just to recap, addictions are a huge public health problem, the leading preventable cause of death and disability in the United States and globally. And the alcohol use disorders are among the most disabling of diseases worldwide. And although cigarettes do account for a lot more deaths, it's important to remember that people don't die young from smoking cigarettes usually, but they do frequently have much shorter lifespans from drinking alcohol or using illicit drugs. So the effect at the individual level can be obviously a lot more devastating. And the annual estimated economic costs of substance use disorders overall in this country alone are estimated at over $500 billion. So that's $500 billion. I realized I'd left out 3 zeros on my previous version of this slide because it just looked like too many, but that's the right number. And they're very common, prevalent disorders too, and just focusing on alcohol, the lifetime prevalence in this country is estimated at 12%. So psychedelics for addiction, very briefly. Most of the work in the 1950s and 60s was with LSD, and in the alcohol story, clinical use began in Saskatchewan around 1953. And it was actually, to some extent, used as a clinical treatment, not as part of a study, but as something you'd go to the rehab place and receive LSD. And the initial model was this idea of hitting bottom and having a sort of horrific delirium tremens-like experience, which would then kind of shock people into sobriety. But the folks working there soon realized that many people were having much more positive transformative experiences, and soon thereafter, in the mid-1950s, adopted what became known as the psychedelic model of therapy, where the emphasis was on occasioning a single overwhelming experience, which would then lead to lasting changes in personality values, in self-concept, and ultimately behavior, including drinking. And this is to be distinguished from the psycholytic model, which was used much more in Europe to treat a variety of depressive and anxiety disorders, used much less in the United States, and used lower doses of LSD on many more occasions. And so, the model that we use today, for the most part, is very closely based on the psychedelic model. Although, as we'll see, the kinds of mechanisms that you might expect to see in the psycholytic model may also be at play in these higher dose models that we're currently employing. A number of other psychedelics were used in the treatment of alcoholism. Mescaline was used more or less interchangeably with LSD back in the 50s and 60s. Dipropyltryptamine, there were a couple of studies done at Spring Grove. Ketamine more recently, Evgeny Krupitsky's work in Russia, and ayahuasca has been used, is just beginning to be studied really as in a clinical context. Opioid addiction, which we won't get into, likewise some work with LSD, ketamine, and of course ibogaine, which are very different drugs. And then Matt's just covered his smoking cessation work. The psilocybin work being much more recent, and then our first pilot study, which I'll describe briefly, was published just a couple years ago. Matt's already showed this slide too. So this is the Krebs and Johansson meta-analysis. And again, just to reiterate, there is a very consistent and clinically meaningful effect across these studies, which were decent studies, but really quite varied in their approach. And the effect is comparable to, somewhat larger than, the effects of the currently available FDA-approved treatments for alcohol use disorder. So how does this work? We'll come back to this, and one of the reasons for talking about this case material and people's experiences is to kind of help us develop models and understandings. And I wish I had some kind of grand unified theory here, but I don't. So we'll just talk about what we're seeing and hope we get there eventually. But one key ingredient is thought to be this classic mystical experience, which you've been hearing about all day and all conference. And in terms of alcohol, the notion of this as a important change mechanism goes back at least as far as William James, who talked about conversion experiences and people suddenly recovering from their alcohol addiction. Carl Jung recognized the importance of this form of change. And then in the 1930s, the Oxford group, which was an evangelical Christian group, created a program in which they essentially ministered to alcoholics and tried to help them have conversion experiences and get sober. And that led more or less directly to the AA model of recovery, which has as its underpinning the concept of spiritual awakening, and was inspired by Bill Wilson's own spiritual awakening experience. And there's a whole backstory about Bill Wilson and LSD, which I won't go into, but which is quite interesting. So other psychological mechanisms, and we don't really have time to unpack each of these either, but ideas that have been discussed, and certainly things that we seem to see in our clinical work, catharsis and abreaction, these emotional releases which seem to have a healing effect, cognitive insight or understanding on a cognitive level, emotional appreciation or understanding on an emotional level, the experience of forgiveness and compassion, including forgiveness and compassion towards oneself, acceptance of self and of one's situation. This sense of enlarged perspective and greater ability to step back and observe what's actually happening without getting caught up. This enlarged sense of self, which could be considered a sort of a spiritual mechanism, but it's not really the same as mystical per se. And then this sense of mindfulness or decreased attachment to thoughts and feelings that arise, and this kind of enlarged, more spacious quality of consciousness that many of our participants will report in the immediate aftermath of their experiences. And then the biological mechanisms, which I'll spend very little time talking about, but obviously there is something going on in the brain that's coexisting with these subjective experiences. There's definitely acute downregulation of the serotonin 2A receptors. There are a lot of reasons to think that neuroplastic changes are occurring secondary to this kind of intense stimulation of those receptors and glutamate receptors downstream. And there's the possibility of neurogenesis, and which has not been clearly demonstrated, but is a reasonable hypothesis to pursue. And then functional changes. We've heard a lot about the acute changes in brain functional connectivity and activation during states of psilocybin intoxication. Much less is known about persisting effects, although we're now seeing some work about next day effects. And but what's happening in a week, a month, 6 months after the experience when the behavior change continues. So the pilot study, Matt kind of covered this for me too, which was good. This was just a proof of concept study, 10 participants. We ran them through 2 psilocybin sessions in the context of a 12-week therapy program, which is similar to what we use in the double-blind study, and I'll describe that a little more in a moment. But this was really to assess feasibility, look at pre-post changes in drinking and see if people appeared to be improving, and also look at changes in related psychological outcomes, which could represent mechanisms of change that we'd want to pursue in later studies. And so here's the same graph that Matt showed you. And the one thing I'd point out from this is that the second, I'm not sure how to do this. Is this point? Okay, so the second point here is 1 month into the therapy when they've had 4 therapy sessions but have not yet received the psilocybin. And you see there's a significant improvement there in that first month, but then there's this really precipitous drop during the month following the first psilocybin session, which is essentially maintained through the end of the follow-up period, which is 36 weeks. And these effects, even relative to this after the psychotherapy run-in, these are large effects on the order of 1.0 pre-post effect. So it doesn't prove efficacy, but it's a pretty impressive nonetheless. And these, all of the positive things that we saw in these participants were correlated with not only with the MEQ scores, which is the mystical experience questionnaire that we've heard about, but also in our study with other broader measures of intensity. So I'm a little less committed to the mystical experience per se as the engine of change here, although I certainly think it's a very important one. But the 5D ASC is the general scale from that is a much broader measure of hallucinogen effects, and we found comparable correlations in terms of change on that measure with drinking improvement in craving, decreases or increases in self-efficacy, which is the confidence that one can change their behavior, and improvement in mood, which we also saw. So our current study, Steve Ross and our team at NYU are conducting. This study I started at UNM, and simultaneously Steve got it going at NYU, and then when I moved to NYU, we phased out the UNM site and are just conducting it at NYU now. But basically, this is an efficacy study. We want to look at the acute effects of psilocybin in this population. And we're going, in some cases, to a higher dose of 40 milligrams per 70 kilograms, which is higher than you've seen in any of the other studies that have been presented here. And then to evaluate the effect of psilocybin on the drinking outcomes and to formally test whether there are particular characteristics of the drug experiences that mediate the behavioral effects of psilocybin. We're conducting an ancillary neuroimaging study looking at changes in resting state, functional connectivity, and cue response that I won't say more about today, an ancillary qualitative study as well. And we've treated 36 participants to date across the 2 sites who've actually received study medication. The treatment model is basically, the double-blind portion of the study is the top sort of 2/3 here. And there are 4 psychosocial treatment sessions in preparation for the first medication session, 4 more sessions, psychosocial sessions, in between the first and second medication session. These are the double-blind sessions. And then 4 more sessions after that. And then we have a third session in which participants are told you will receive active psilocybin in this session, and we won't be talking about we'll be talking about that a little bit, but I don't have outcomes going out to the very end for most of these participants. There are 3 basic components to the treatment model. The first is the alcohol-focused component, which is basically motivational enhancement therapy plus some fairly straightforward cognitive behavioral therapy elements to help people address their alcohol directly. And then the second part is what we call PSI, which is preparation, support, and integration. It's the psychedelic therapy package to help people navigate and make the most of their psychedelic experience. And it's very similar to what all the other groups are doing. And then there are the drug administration sessions themselves, in which we don't conduct active therapy, but provide whatever support may be needed. We're using 2 co-therapists, male and female co-therapists, as are most of the other groups here. And this is kind of what it looks like, although this is not an actual session. And more often we'll be sitting back on the chairs and just being there. But if somebody... Sarah was having a hard time and needed a little support, so we got down closer to her and took care of her. This is a simulated session, by the way. There's no actual medication involved. Okay, so now we're ready for our case studies. So I'm going to present 3 participants. These are people who were participating in the ongoing trial. They all had intense, personally meaningful experiences in their medication sessions. And we selected them to represent the variety of experiences and outcomes that have been observed. They're not necessarily demonstrating that this treatment works. I mean, for that matter, we don't really know whether these people received psilocybin or placebo, or it's actually not placebo, it's diphenhydramine in this study. So, they do have an opinion. We, independently write down what we think they might have received, and you will probably have an opinion as well. So this is the first person. He's a 25-year-old man who's living with his parents, working in an investment firm, a fairly stressful job. He was a binge drinker who would have frequent blackouts and absences from work, had a very extensive treatment history, including inpatient, more than 1 inpatient treatment, multiple medication trials. His family was supportive. At intake, he'd been drinking only 6 out of 84 days, but an average of 22 drinks per drinking day. So think about that, what that means. That's a standard drink, which is like a shot of whiskey or a beer. So very intense drinking when he did drink. He had minimal psychedelic experience. 3 times he'd used MDMA, no classic hallucinogen use. First medication session. So this would have been 25 milligrams per 70 kilogram of psilocybin or 50 milligrams of diphenhydramine. He spent much of the first session wondering if he had received psilocybin, and like he would say from time to time, I'm not sure I got it. He really wasn't sure. In his post-session questionnaires, he indicated a moderate intensity of experience. feelings of awe, insights, alterations in perception of self, and dissipation of his everyday worries and fears. He spontaneously reported a deep sense of inner peace that he felt stayed with him after the session. And he remained abstinent between the first and second session, and was surprised at how easy that was, given how the experience he'd had before. Second session, the dose was increased to what's written there. And this session, he experienced a much stronger effects and had significant anxiety. He said it felt something, he didn't say I died and was reborn, but he said it was something like dying and being reborn. And he was confronted with the harmful effects of his drinking on him and on others, and found this quite painful. But by the end was feeling this strong sense of inner peace. And although he was able to articulate very little of this, when you looked at his questionnaire reports, he had a lot of mystical type content, and really on all of the dimensions of the classic mystical experience. So he remained sober during that whole double-blind period and came back for his third open-label session. This one was, again, a bit more intense and challenging, but he said he had a few sort of peak eureka moments and ended up feeling calm and reassured. And he was abstinent at the end of the study. We've heard from him periodically, and he's still doing extremely well. His quote from him, "I wouldn't be surprised if I never drank again. I got exactly what I needed out of the experience," which is something that a lot of people seem to say. He had no desire to repeat the experience, but he wondered if additional sessions could be helpful in the future if he were to become tempted to drink alcohol, because we had no ability to offer anything like that to him. And he continued to be amazed at how little desire to drink he had. He also reported that he was more able to let go of negative thoughts and resentments and not get so stuck on them. And he retained a vivid memory of this peace experience that he had, that he said he thought about it every day. So that was him. Second case is very different. So this was a 52-year-old man, African-American man. He was living with a roommate, and he'd been unemployed for over a year prior to the trial. He'd been drinking heavily since college, where it had impaired his academic and athletic performance, and he'd felt he'd wasted much of his life due to drinking. His social and family life revolved around alcohol, and he was concerned about eventual health consequences because his father had died of complications of alcoholism. He also was a Muslim, and he was very conflicted about his drinking in relation to his faith. He had no treatment history, and he'd been drinking almost every day at a lower level, but still, right around the heavy drinking limit, 4 drinks per drinking day. He had a very remote history of mescaline use. And he had a very different first session. He rapidly felt very strong effects, which were dominated by the experience of intense nausea and abdominal pain, and he threw up a little bit, but he at one point he felt that he kind of made contact with his father and experienced some forgiveness from him. And then he really felt, because of his Muslim faith, that his job was to resist the experience with all his might and to try to fight off the effects of the drug. And he spent the next 2 hours kind of doubled over a trash can, spitting up or spitting out shame, resentment, regret, and anger. So it was really one of these literally cathartic experiences. And eventually he became exhausted and lay down and kind of gave up on trying to control the experience and felt more comfortable. And his quote from him was, "Nothing ever felt worse than those 2 hours." It was impressively unpleasant for him. Did I skip the last comment on him? Yeah, so he did not elect to have another session, but he completed all the remaining therapy sessions and outcomes. And he was pleased that he had weathered the storm and felt great urgency to put his life back into order, got a job, began to feel more self-forgiveness as things got better, and he remained abstinent also at his last follow-up, and he's currently engaged in a social work program focusing on addiction. Okay, third one. I wish we had more time, but I want to get through to the end here. So this was a 52-year-old woman working in healthcare. She was concerned about the effects of drinking on her physical and mental health, had some anxiety and depression that was exacerbated. And her drinking led to isolation, hangovers, feelings of guilt and shame, and this intense self-critical process that was very central to her experience. Her mother had been severely emotionally and sometimes physically abusive, and she'd left her at age 7 to live with grandparents. She was drinking most days, and 3 drinks on average, sometimes more, sometimes less, and she had no previous psychedelic use. So she'd cut down a little bit prior to the first medication session, but was not, it was still drinking. In the first session, she spent a lot of time thinking about her mother's neglect, but didn't really feel angry about it. And she began this dialogue with God and asked God, "Why did you leave me?" And the answer was, "Why are you so controlling?" So that was something that kind of puzzled her. The self-critical thoughts diminished dramatically after this first session, and her mood improved. She did not want to commit to complete abstinence. She was kind of thought that played into this self-critical, self-defeating thought process, but she was drinking much less. The second session, we increased her dose to the 40 milligram level, and she was initially quite anxious and overwhelmed, and when she was able to let go of that, experienced this really beautiful oceanic state in which she heard her voice telling her she was the perfect creation of the universe, and she found that she was able to believe that. After this, she categorically felt that the self-critical thoughts were gone, and that's pretty much remained the case. She was managing her stress at work much better, improving her relationship with her mother, and continued to be abstinent or drinking no more than 2 drinks at a time, except for election day when she had a binge drinking episode, and she was probably not alone in that. After that, she did not lose control of her drinking or have a recurrence of the self-critical thoughts. She did get a bit more depressed. She came back for her 3rd session, and this was a very anxious experience for her, but she found it also kind of cleansing and was able to let go of a lot of this worry about the situation of the world. And felt kind of rejuvenated. So I'm going to skip over the quantitative data, which complement this nicely, but are less critical to the stories. These are the drinking outcomes. These are our various mediators, and things got better as we'd expect pretty much across the board. So overall, I would say these experiences are highly varied. They're intensely personally meaningful, and their context is much larger than the alcohol problem. And themes of forgiveness, self-compassion, and love in many cases seem to be at least as salient as the classic mystical experience. And this spaciousness or increased mindfulness also seems to be very important. So, and also that different kinds of people seem to benefit in different kinds of ways. So. And also some people benefit better than others. Not everybody did quite this well, but many people do seem to be benefiting. So I'll wrap it up, but we just want to learn more, collect more experience and data, and interested in anybody's idea about how all this is working. So thank you. Thank you.